Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Today, I wanted to talk about the subject of food insecurity. Food insecurity is a global problem, but it manifests itself in different ways in different parts of the world. There are two major types of food insecurity, and we will obviously address both types in this podcast. One, which we will talk about first, is malnutrition, and the second is starvation. Here in the first world, where I am, in the USA, we have a higher rate of malnutrition than we should. There really is no reason that the United States, the wealthiest country in the world, should have any malnutrition at all. And yet we do. And expectedly, that malnutrition is highest among the poor. Why? Well, there are various reasons. One is the inability to pay for high quality food. So people will frequently eat fattier foods or may go to fast food restaurants. And the quality of food in many fast food restaurants is really, really bad. Again, it's often very fatty. And in many cases, people are not even getting what they think they're ordering. Like, you may think you're ordering a hamburger. You say, I want a hamburger. But are you actually getting a hamburger? Well, I guess that depends on how you define a hamburger. In many cases, the quantity of beef or even vegetable products that are contained in a hamburger is relatively low. It's basically filler. And basically, you're not really getting nutritious content at all if you are poor. And that explains one aspect of why there is a high rate of malnutrition in a wealthy country, the wealthiest country in the world, the United States of America. So there is a high rate, or a relatively high rate, of malnutrition in the first world, much higher than it needs to be. There shouldn't be any malnutrition at all, in my opinion. What about starvation? Is there starvation in the first world? Well, the answer to that is yes, but very, very little. Very little. It is hard, literally hard, to starve to death in the first world because there is always some kind of food available. It may not be very nutritious. It may lead to malnutrition, which we just talked about, which shortens life expectancy, but there is still food available. The food may be difficult to find, and that is often the reason. The reason for that is often that that many supermarkets and higher quality restaurants are simply not willing to open in poor neighborhoods, often because of high crime rates. So that leads to high malnutrition rates, but not high starvation rates. So again, difference between malnutrition and starvation. High malnutrition rates in the first world, low starvation rates in the first world. Now, when we go to the third world, and as somebody who has been to two third world countries, Congo and Mexico, I wish I would have gone to more. Maybe I will at some point in the future, but I literally sometimes find the fact that I have not to be unforgivable. I really should be able to be an eyewitness to more than what I have seen in Congo and Mexico, and sadly, I am not. I am not that kind of an eyewitness. As a sociologist, especially, I should have that kind of knowledge available, but my knowledge of food insecurity in the third world is limited, much more limited than it should be. Now, in the third world, unlike the first world, there are both high rates of malnutrition and high rates of starvation. Now, the reasons for high malnutrition in the third world are pretty much the same as they are in the first world. But the reason why starvation rates are as high as they are in many parts of the third world, certainly not all of it, but many parts of it, is because of real poverty. Now, what people call poverty in the first world is on a totally different level than poverty in the third world. A very poor person in the first world, by third world standards, would be seen as relatively well off. There are not that many people in the first world who live by third world standards. And so when you go into the third world, an entirely different definition of poverty needs to be used. In sociology, we call that absolute poverty. What is absolute poverty? Absolute poverty is where you simply cannot, in terms of food, get enough food to keep you alive. So no matter what you do, no matter what job you have, no matter how much you are paid, you are still not going to get enough money from your job that will allow you to buy food that will keep you from starving to death. And such is the fate of many people who live in the third world. I have seen that directly. I really wish that I would have seen it more. Not because obviously not because I want to see more people die of starvation, but because I feel as though, as a sociologist, again, I should be able to tell you more cases of starvation than I am able to. There is only one case I can tell you about, and that is unfortunate. I am really sorry that I can't tell you more, but it's the only one that I have in my head. I have not seen any others. When I was in Kinshasa, the capital of what was once Zaire, what is now the Congo, I would walk down the main street of Kinshasa, and I would see bodies lining the streets, dead bodies lining the streets. Now, I talked about that in the first season of this podcast, but it keeps on haunting me. Ever since I made that podcast, somehow I can't seem to get the thought out of my mind, even more than when I actually saw it directly. And I think that is because, as an autistic, when I was actually in Kinshasa, I really had no empathy. Now, I was compassionate. I recognized the injustice. of seeing dead bodies in the street, but I couldn't feel any empathy, or as I prefer to call it, intersubjectivity. I could not identify with the thoughts, feelings of other people. I couldn't. I tried, and I always wondered why I could not, but I couldn't. Such is the problem with many autistics, not all autistics. And male autistics are more likely to experience this than female autistics. Female autistics have a much higher chance of being empathetic than male autistics. And sadly, I was not empathetic at all. So since I discussed this, the memories came flooding back into my head. And I began remembering, picturing all the scenes that I saw walking down this one street with dead bodies lining the streets. I don't understand in retrospect why that did not make a deeper impression on my heart, but it did not. The main street that I'm talking about looks like any street that one would see in a big city in Europe or North America. In many cases, the same stores. But the people there, the majority of people there, cannot afford the prices of things in those stores. When I was in Kinshasa, it was one of the two most expensive cities in sub-Saharan Africa. The most expensive city was Johannesburg. The second most expensive was where I was, in Kinshasa. Really unexcusable. There's no excuse for that kind of thing. Much as where I'm living now, which is a relatively poor area of the United States, the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, we have the second highest medical costs in the United States after Miami, Florida. Why that is? Well, because of blatant corruption, just pure greed. That's the only realistic explanation for it. When I was in Kinshasa again, where I was staying, I would leave the place I was staying, which was in a fortified area, basically. There were literally security guards stationed at the entrances to keep out the poor people, the needy people from coming in. We had gates all around the place, almost like being in a prison. There were bars on the windows. That is not an unusual sight in much of the third world, because anybody who is somebody, anybody who is not a third worlder, who can afford the cost of living in one of those places, is going to try to keep the poor out. And I think to myself, say I had stayed in Kinshasa, which I didn't. I was only there for a few weeks. But say I had remained there, and my intention in going there was to remain there. The only reason why I left was because I was given incorrect information. I was told that I could complete my Ph.D. in Kinshasa. After I got there, I found out that that was not true. In fact, there was not even a Ph.D. program at the University of Zaire in Kinshasa. The president of the university, his office was about the size of a large walk-in closet. So I left. But I remember now, since I did the last podcast, on the third world, seeing people walk through the poor residential neighborhoods of Kinshasa with bloated bellies. What does that mean? That means that they are literally starving to death. They are consuming themselves from the inside out. Or to put it more bluntly, they are dying. They are dying. They are dying. I was not. I was well fed. The entire time I was there, I had nothing to worry about. The quality of water in Kinshasa was awful. You turn on the tap, and the water literally has dirt in it. It's like you see the dirt pouring out of the tap along with the water. People who live in Kinshasa generally will put the water through a filter to take out the dirt. But then the water has all these microbes in it, bacteria in it, which could kill you. Certainly, if I drank that water without boiling it, it would kill me. But because their bodies are so used to it, they are able to live while drinking that quality of water. Now, obviously, it is reducing their life expectancy, but their bodies are used to it, and that's just what they drink. That's the only thing they can drink. I mean, they do sell soft drinks in Kinshasa, but most people who live in Kinshasa cannot afford to buy soft drinks. Soft drinks are very expensive in Kinshasa. Everything is very expensive. What it was and it still is in Kinshasa. It is an extremely high-priced city with an extremely poor population. Very, very sad. Seeing people with bloated bellies, often carrying things on top of their heads. And when I look back on it now, what I didn't think of at the time is that I am literally looking at people who are dying. I don't know why I didn't think of that. I mean, I knew it. Intellectually, I knew it. I was aware of it. I was conscious of it, but it was not in my heart because I had no heart. I had no heart for the people that I was seeing in Kinshasa. I was upset, not because of seeing people starving to death, but I was upset that I could not get my Ph.D. there and that I had to spend time, waste time as I thought of it, going there, packing my stuff up, which I obviously did in advance before leaving the US, and worrying about what would happen to my stuff. Would I be able to get it back to the US? The answer was yes. But that's what I cared about. I cared about my stuff. I cared about my own life. I cared about leaving Kinshasa, going back to the US to finish first my master's degree and then afterwards my PhD. That's all I cared about. That's literally all I cared about. That is what autism does. It destroys the human soul. It destroys the heart. It consumes one's own sense of humanity. It is very sad to me. The it is difficult for me to express that sorrow in this podcast. The problem is the more I talk about it, the sadder I become. What bothers me is that ordinarily I just go through the day without thinking about it. I worry about things that are of no consequence. Like, for example, I'm thinking now about how am I going to get home in time to meet somebody on Zoom. That's my concern. That's what I'm thinking about. Will I be able to meet that person on Zoom? Yes. But I'm concerned about the fact that I will have to go and do that rather quickly to be on time. Something so trivial, something so unimportant, and yet that is what concerns me. Meanwhile, people in Kinshasa, people in Gaza, people in Haiti, people in other parts of the world are dying painful deaths, whether caused by war or starvation. Now, the issue here is starvation, but of course, starvation is not the only problem faced in the third world. But it is the problem that we are talking about now. And so, to return to the subject of starvation, when one is starving to death, it is a painful way to die. There are different ways to die. Some are painful, some are not painful at all, like dying in one's sleep, and some are somewhere in between. I hope that I die in my sleep. I hope. But then, when I think of people that I've seen who were literally starving to death in Kinshasa, I think, why do I deserve to die in my sleep? What gives me the privilege of dying in my sleep? Now, certainly some people die in their sleep, even very poor people, even people who were starving to death in Kinshasa. They are dying of starvation. I am not going to die of starvation, especially as a multimillionaire. I have no right to be a multimillionaire. I am being completely honest. I'm not saying it to impress anybody. That is literally how I feel. I have no right to be a multimillionaire. In a communist society, I don't know whether people like me would even exist. I don't know. I'm not sure. But even if people like me did exist, those people that I saw who were dying of starvation and those dead bodies I saw laying on the streets of downtown Kinshasa, those bodies would not be there. Those people would be alive, going to work, raising their families, having fun, and doing other things that they want to do. But unfortunately, they can't do that. Just like the people in Gaza, who are now also, in some cases, dying of starvation. So it is a sad, sad situation. Talking about it right now literally makes me feel like I want to get on a plane tomorrow and fly to one of these places. Fly to Haiti, for example, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, where people starve to death all the time. Or to India, or to Bangladesh, or back to Kinshasa. I don't feel as though I have a right to be in the situation I am in. As a moral realist, not a moral relativist, I believe that emancipation should be universal. That emancipation needs to include emancipation from food insecurity. But in the world that we are living in right now, that kind of emancipation is simply a pipe dream. It does not exist. There is no such emancipation for a large section of the Earth's population. And here I am, sitting in the Rio Grande Valley, concerned about the high level of corruption that exists here, and it does. And it is troublesome. It bothers everyone who lives here, and I can understand, I can empathize with them because it bothers me too. Nobody should have to deal with that kind of corruption, especially medical corruption, but also the corruption which leads to food insecurity. Food is plentiful in the first world. Nobody should have to suffer under malnutrition. Food is plentiful all over the world. Nobody should have to suffer with starvation. No one should have to starve to death. And yet, as I am speaking right now, people are starving to death. And what bothers me, honestly, is that there is literally nothing that I can do to change it. So part of me says, well, Mark, since there's nothing that I can do to change it, why worry about it? Why waste my time focusing on something that I can't change? Why not just focus on things that I can change? And there is some merit to that argument, I suppose. But I think to be a human being means that we need to have empathy, even in cases where we cannot resolve certain problems, like starvation or malnutrition. Otherwise, are we truly human beings? For the time being, this is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.